Hi, folks. Good morning and welcome. This is Suchinth Kumar at ISSQUARED. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer, and welcome to the show. And thank you very much for taking the time to tune in. Now, in the previous show, in the episode, we talked with Nikolay Chernavsky about identities, and we touched a little bit on zero trust. And we mentioned towards the end of the show that zero trust is something that would need kind of a second episode, a more double click. And we also received a lot of questions from some of the audience members. So I have with me today on the show, our guest is Nikolay Chernavsky. I'm very excited to be talking about zero trust. But before I kind of get into a few more detailed questions with Nikolay, just some thoughts on zero trust. My own kind of viewpoint on this, as well as speaking to industry peers, customers, as well as technology partners, I find that the word zero trust has been overused and kind of to some degree misused and used very loosely or generically. And I think a lot of folks whom I've talked to kind of share this opinion. You see a lot of vendors advertising as, hey, this product is zero trust, and there's some kind of maybe misunderstanding with some folks as to zero trust is a particular tool will give you zero trust or complete security. But what we're going to do in this session is dive a little deeper into zero trust, and also maybe clarify on some of the myths and go beyond the hype on zero trust. Fundamentally, zero trust is an approach, it's a strategy, and it's a framework. And there's a series of things you can do to approach zero trust and to implement strategies and technologies that get you to a zero trust framework. So that's kind of what we're going to go into in this show today. So with that, I'm going to take a step back with Nikolay and have Nikolay Chernavsky, who's the Chief Security Officer as well as the Head of Security Practice for ISSQUARED, to talk about zero trust. So, Nikolay, for the benefit of our audience and kind of to re-baseline, just to go beyond the hype, what is zero trust?
All right, hi everyone. Thank you, Suchin, for having me back again. And definitely, zero trust is something that a lot of people talk about, and it's been very misused, abused word, so to speak. And it reminds me sort of when I started back in the day, and I visited the RSA show in 2015, and at that time the word was threat intelligence. So we were doing security, and then all of a sudden you see like a bunch of companies pop up here and there. And then when I went to the RSA show in 2015, there was literally entire floor. Every company had this word in their names, like we do threat intelligence, and we discover all this one. We go to the dark web. So everyone was trying to use buzzwords that were popular at this time to boost their company marketing machines and so on. So zero trust in some way looks exactly the same way back in the day, and then kind of like you look back in a forward from 2015 to 2022, companies that used to do well with threat intelligence and were actually true companies to their core, so they pretty much stayed in business, and everyone else ended up dropping those buzzwords. So if you look at zero trust, it's somewhat in right now feels the same way. Everyone is trying to get their name out, and they're trying to add this. But by definition, if I'm going to read it out loud now, what essentially NIST says about zero trust, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. So zero trust provides a collection of concepts and ideas designed to minimize uncertainty in enforcing accurate, least privilege, pre-request access decision in information systems and services in the face of a network viewed as compromised. So it's kind of like a lot of words and pretty heavy words in the definition of zero trust, but to digest them a little bit, we can look at zero trust as nobody trusts anyone. So, and everyone looks at everything is treated as a resource on network. So, whatever or whenever or whoever tries to do something at any given point in time, they have to be authenticated, they have to be authorized, and the access has to be provided at the right moment and at the right time, and then withdrawn right after when it's no longer needed. So it's pretty big concept, and it's not technological thing that somebody can easily drop on a network and say, well, check this out, I got zero trust now, so it doesn't happen. And I think the biggest thing that people need to decide at the beginning, zero trust is a architecture. It's a journey. So you cannot just step into it and say, I'm going to be there tomorrow. And the more important thing about zero trust is also cultural change. So right now we're looking at all those things in kind of like one light. We get in the office and we type our login name password, and maybe we have 2FA, and all of a sudden magic happens and we have access to everything. So zero trust takes this away.
Comment that you made, a couple of comments. One, it's a cultural change. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And when we say cultural change, we're talking from a technology and business landscape of how we look at security going forward. And second, and probably equally important, is that for many companies, it's a journey and more of a continuous journey as the threat landscape evolves. And what we've seen with various companies right now is, as I've indicated, like, you hear about projects or programs that are looking at some element of zero trust. And obviously, this varies largely between the size of the company. Some of the larger companies that we've seen in the enterprise space have spent a lot of money on different tools, but are now implementing projects around zero trust. So, given the wide swath of companies, maybe if you could just take an example, Nikolay, of how does the company start with zero trust? Is it a program? Is it a kind of an ongoing architecture discussion? What's the best way that you would advise a company to start with thinking about zero trust and to move forward on that roadmap?
Right, Sachin, and something that you pointed out, and we talked briefly about it. So a lot of companies, and depending the size of the companies and how the information security organization built out and who is driving the initiatives, in many cases, people view it as I'm going to buy something and put it, and it's going to be implemented tomorrow. And I've seen people take these steps and to realize later on that there are a lot more to it than just fancy software that somebody just sold to say, yes, I'm going to build you zero trust. And this is the piece of software you need to buy. So I think the right approach that the company take is to start analyzing what they're actually trying to protect, because you can't really solve everything in one time. So different resources require different level of trust, different organizations are, let's say, if you take hospital, for instance, if you try to go with zero trust and say, I want to create zero trust for MRI machines or nurses or doctors when they do surgeries and they use all this equipment, you introducing huge complexity in the equation of saving somebody's life. So now, if your zero trust present the problem for somebody getting into an MRI machine and patient dies, hospital bears responsibility, and probably whoever designed zero trust around this particular thing will have some answers, questions to answer. So in a way, organizations need to slice it and dice it what they're trying to protect, because zero trust offers the greatest protection if designed it properly, and but the greatest protection comes with all the consequences that I mentioned. It creates a lot of friction. So there's no more all this fancy conversation that people used to have once you authenticate it and you continuously trust it. It happens all the time, and this happens all the time creates friction. And try to ask doctors to type password more than once. It's extremely difficult because it's not business that they're in. They're in business of saving people's lives, and they cannot just go in and arbitrarily every 30 seconds. So I need this instrument. Let me go and type the password or authenticate me one way or the other. So, and that's essentially where people. It's an extreme example that I'm giving, but that's where organizations need to actually pay attention to and try to understand entire business flow from inside out. So how somebody gets information, how much friction they can tolerate, what they can do with information, and so on. And then once you understand the whole chain sort of how information travels, who has access to it, when it's supposed to be given to, and so on, then you can start applying all this concept, and then you can find the tools that will support those concepts that you're trying to implement. And some of them will work right, and some of them probably you can partially implement zero trust. But this is answer to your question is like, where would they start? They need to start from inside out, and they need to understand exactly what is happening in their environment and how they can protect whatever they're trying to protect, and with minimum friction that they can introduce, but the maximum protection.
Thanks, Nikolai. And I think that only kind of reiterates the point we were making earlier in the discussion that there are several elements to zero trust, and really good insight from you on kind of what's the best way or our thinking on how to start with zero trust. And I know from a zero trust approach and strategy perspective, there's a number of elements, namely, networking, identity, and others. For this discussion, I want to focus in a little more on identities. Can you talk or elaborate more on the role of identity in zero trust, Nikolai?
Say it's pivotal to anything that people do. So, and if you look at tenets of zero trust, there are at least couple that talked about specifically what organizations need to address, and one of them is access to individual enterprise resources is granted on per session basis. So that talks about strictly about how to identify who is accessing it and when to give them access to, and provide them least privileges. And there is also another one that monitors, it talks about the same thing, and also all resource authentication authorizations are dynamic and strictly enforced before access is allowed. So essentially, what it all means, so when you have designed, and I think it's a critical component to somebody trying to embark on this journey to understand how their identity and access management system right now it's created, designed, and what are the touch points between different systems. Because now, once you introduce the zero trust concept, you're breaking all those things away. So right now, let's say we're talking in this session and on this video and with our audience, but I've been only authenticated whenever I received the link. So if somebody came in and kidnapped me all of a sudden and somebody else started talking my stead, nobody would notice except people who are actually right now watching the video and say, well, this is not Nikolai anymore. So now you remove the face and people recognize Nikolai, but in a digital world, you don't have the face. You have all those digital identities that floating around. And when you grant access to somebody, how do you know that 15 minutes from now it's somebody access hasn't been hijacked? So when you come into work, your session is usually granted to have access to all the resources and everything else for, let's say, 8 hours or 9 hours for duration, or probably some organization set it up session for 24 hours. Now you need to think from identity perspective, how can I make it so the session is dynamic? So it's not 24, it's not 8 hours, but it goes only when Suchinth needs access to. So when you go to the system, it provides you access and terminates your sessions, and you're pretty much done. And also, it helps you during this session when you're trying to get access to the resource, actually authenticate you again to validate that actually you. And there will be additional factors that can be extracted or taken out of identity and access system based on whatever you do to tell. It's kind of like the conversation how to eliminate some friction. So it will help you also to say, yes, I know it's Suchin because he did certain things, and those are the things that companies need to think of how to incorporate the zero trust. And now, bigger picture, when you talk about identities, right? You have executive management that comes to play, and how many times executive management tell you that they don't want to type password anymore, they don't want to have kind of any kind of friction, and they want to get access to whatever they want to get access when they need to have access. So have you had those conversations? Because you're part of identity and access and you've been around governance for quite some time. So I'm kind of trying to turn in a little bit question onto you. So from your perspective, what have you seen that people actually complaining about in identity and access management space?
That's a fantastic question, and I've been dealing with identities for almost the better part of 2 decades, and one of the biggest challenges that I saw actually in the early days of multi-factor and two-factor authentication was a massive pushback from business users on kind of usability. So there's this today, MFA is actually looked upon very positively, and it's kind of part of daily life. But back in the day, there was tremendous resistance. So there's this continuous push and pull between more security versus does more security impede usability. And in my discussions in more recent years with CIOs in particular and CISOs has been how do we increase security with and still have kind of a frictionless user experience. And that's the biggest question I get from executives in particular, is that hey, we really want to do all these identity and security programs, but we don't want to keep the user experience, make the user experience worse. So some of the common things, and unfortunately that happens with many IT projects, is you release an upgrade, and then a lot of end users actually think that their experience and their whole experience with the tool has actually gone down, or with the whole IT environment. So there's this continuous kind of, I would say, push and pull between usability and security. But I think tools are, or technology is also getting better. And I think in terms of things like continuous authentication, passwordless authentication, those concepts and technologies. And I believe that even on the business side of things, people have a much better understanding of today and education around ransomware and the threats that exist. So there's a little more acceptance on, hey, to have better security, there's certain things that need to happen. But what I've seen is the companies that have the best success in rolling out applications, technologies, but still maintaining a very good security posture are those that look very carefully at what the end user experience is going to be, what technologies make sense, what don't make sense. But you're absolutely right, Nikolay. Every time you add a new security technology or a new authentication method in particular, and a username and password in particular, that is where I'm seeing the maximum resistance and concern from CIOs that, hey, I'm going to do all this for security, but I'm going to get a bad rep from the user community and explain to the business. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Nikolai. I think this whole move, it has not been frictionless over the years. Having said that, I am beginning to see that technologies and adaptive authentication, user behavior analysis, risk-based authentication, all these things are making it easier to find that balance. But I think if you want to have a successful identity strategy, security strategy, as well as zero trust strategy, you need to kind of balance very carefully between security tenets, security guardrails and frameworks, and what the business experience is going to be. I don't know, Nikolai, if that answers. I don't think there's a magic answer, but in summary, I have seen some very animated discussions in past years, but I think it's getting a bit better now.
Yeah, Suchinth, you kind of hit the nail on the head. So, and when you describe adoption of multi-factor authentication, right, it's a kind of small portion of zero trust that somebody is trying to build at the very teeny mini step. But now, let's say when you move to zero trust, and when you ask somebody, again, executive accepted it, and people also accepted it, and everyone has right now pretty much everywhere 2FA. So but it happens only once per session. Now, in the realm of zero trust, it happens every time the system decides it's not you. So imagine that going back to this well to say, hey guys, I'm going to implement zero trust right now, and you're going to be asked to provide 2FA every 10 minutes. So how do you think this is going to conversation go? So that's where organizations need to be a little bit careful when they thinking about zero trust and embarking on this sort of journeys, like how do we massage or message this particular concept, and how do we introduce to the business, and how we can get them on board to explain that it's going to be safer, but at the same time there's going to be friction, and we need to understand how to overcome friction, and what kind of technologies we need to bring in, because like I said at the beginning, it's a big culture shock to a lot of organization once the zero trust is introduced and what it delivers. So there is no more this intrinsic trust all the time, and organizations, and like every technology, it has its own quirks, right? everyone says, yeah, it works seamlessly, it's perfect, and until you install it, and then you realize that, well, it's not really perfect, and it doesn't really work all the time. And the example I was given before, when you go to hospital situation or any other critical, it's extremely sort of annoying when somebody has to do something and they cannot deliver what they're trying to do, like say patients. So it will be very little acceptance or tolerance for something that doesn't really help them to do their work faster. And I think, kind of thinking in my past where I've been, the only place I've been that I would say they didn't call it zero trust, but they didn't trust anyone anyway. It's a secret services building, so you go there, and every turn you make, they're going to do background checks on you, and then they monitor you all the time, and then every door you have to go and scan your badge, or not every door works. And to make matter worse, they don't even have numbers on every doors or labels. So if you wander in some room, you may not even find your way back if you don't know your location within the building and how everything functions. So it was kind of interesting experience, but thinking right now, it was probably early days implementation of zero trust at the physical level, where you can't relocate anything and you have to be essentially escorted by somebody, or somebody has to know exactly ins and out and they positively identify you. So
Thanks, Nikolai. That's an interesting analogy, but it's really, I think, the origins of zero trust. If you go back, and as you said, it's a thought process, it's a strategy, and it's an approach. Now, before we conclude the show, Nikolai, outside of identity, are there any other key components or any other important points to note about zero trust before we conclude the show?
So I think zero trust is not just about identity, and like you said, that's just a little sliver that we touch. So everything that organization has any kind of resource, zero trust concept should be applied. And organizations need to look at every single thing. So you can talk about network, can talk about data, you can talk about your endpoints, and you can talk, databases, and you can say, yes, I want to make sure that all the data goes through your network, it's encrypted, regardless whether it's inside or outside. So in a way, organizations, easy way to think about zero trust, it's everything is untrusted. So consider that whatever you do is exposed to everyone, and now you need to safeguard it to make sure that only right people have access to it.
Perfect. Thanks, Nikolai. That was very informative, very insightful, and it's very good to have these candid conversations. And to summarize, I think zero trust is it's an approach, it's a strategy, and it's a framework, and provides a series of guardrails and tools and technologies and processes to get to that level of zero trust security that Nikolai just described. So it's always good to have these candid conversations, because I do believe that there's still a lot of confusion, and may not be intentional, but it's perpetuated by a lot of technology vendors, a lot of discussions, maybe the thinking that there's a magic bullet tool. But what we've seen so far, it's still early days, relatively speaking. If you look at the timeline of identity and authentication and security, zero trust is obviously, there's a number of companies that are in various stages of maturity, but it's still early days. And I think it's a good time for companies to look at their strategy, their roadmap, and it's something continuous, and to look at the tools and technologies and processes that have made also tremendous progress in the last 2 to 3 years in this regard. But Nikolai, thank you very much. And also, I want to thank all the audience for tuning in today. Please submit any questions if you have them. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. I'm sure in subsequent episodes of this show, we'll talk more about different other elements of zero trust. But we hope you enjoyed the discussion, especially around the aspects around identity and zero trust. And Nikolai, always a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.